when a routine traffic stop transforms into a moment that defines a career. A police officer's worst assumptions meet a truth he never saw coming. His target is a man who holds his future in his hands. The sun was sinking lower in the sky over the streets of Sacramento, painting the clouds with golden hues. Nathan Hayes was heading home after a long day at the office. His car hummed steadily as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to shake off the stress of the day. The radio played softly in the background, offering a calm contrast to the city's frantic pace. Nathan approached a yellow light, slowing down just as it turned red. It was then that the piercing flash of blue and red lights lit up his rearview mirror, followed by the blaring sound of a police siren. Nathan's brow furrowed slightly as he glanced back, pulling his car over to the curb. He rolled down his window as a patrol car slid into place behind him. Out stepped Officer Damon Clark, a man in his mid-30s with a short, cropped haircut and a badge gleaming on his chest. Clark adjusted his belt and walked with an air of confidence, his steps sure as if he were in control of the entire situation. "License and registration," Clark said curtly, his tone businesslike but with a layer of authority. Nathan complied without a word, reaching into the glove compartment for his registration and handing over his driver's license. His movements were slow and deliberate, yet Clark's eyes never left him, scanning him closely as if searching for a deeper reason to dig into the situation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Clark asked, leaning in slightly. "I'm not entirely sure," Nathan replied calmly. "I thought I slowed down in time, but I guess it's possible I didn't make a full stop." Clark didn't respond right away, his eyes narrowing as he studied Nathan. The officer wasn't so sure this was a routine stop anymore. His posture subtly shifted, signaling that something more was at play here. He glanced down at the driver's license. "You're not from around here, are you?" Clark asked. Nathan hesitated for a second before replying. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." Clark didn't seem to be paying much attention. His questions carried a new edge, hinting that he wasn't concerned with the traffic violation anymore. The tension in the air was thickening, and Nathan sensed the officer's shift in focus. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Clark asked, his tone now more pointed. "Just going home," Nathan answered, his voice steady despite the subtle shift in atmosphere. Clark no longer saw Nathan as just another motorist. To him, Nathan had become something more, a target. The officer's gaze held a touch of suspicion as he stepped back and folded Nathan's documents slowly, tucking them into his chest pocket. There was a faint hint of a smirk on Clark's face, as if he'd already judged Nathan's character and decided there was more to investigate. "Step out of the car for me," Clark ordered. Nathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily, but his face remained neutral. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Clark's lips twitched, trying to conceal his irritation. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." The unspoken threat was clear. Nathan exhaled and opened the door. As he stepped out, Clark's eyes roamed over him, assessing him like a threat. Nathan stood tall, his broad shoulders and tailored suit giving the impression of professionalism. Yet his calm demeanor suggested he wasn't intimidated by the officer's posture. "Hands where I can see them," Clark ordered, his voice hard. Nathan complied, his movements deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Clark's smirk deepened. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. Can't be too careful." He circled slightly, clearly probing for a reason. "Any reason?" "To escalate." Nathan turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Clark. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or is this about something else?" The question hit Clark like a punch. For a moment, his confidence wavered. He straightened up, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt, but his attempt at intimidation didn't work. "Watch your tone," Clark muttered, his voice turning colder. "I'm simply asking a question," Nathan replied calmly, his voice steady despite the growing tension. There was no defiance, just a quiet firmness that made Clark uneasy. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works," Clark said, narrowing his eyes. "Got something to hide?" Nathan held the silence for a beat before answering. "No, officer. I just believe in transparency when it comes to interactions like this. Clark scoffed but said nothing, stepping back and pacing in front of Nathan's car, visibly unsettled. The officer's frustration mounted as Nathan remained unshaken. Clark wasn't used to this kind of challenge, especially not from someone like Nathan. You seem pretty confident, Clark muttered under his breath, almost to himself. Like you know how this is going to go. Nathan tilted his head slightly. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is. Clark froze, staring at Nathan as though he'd said something that rattled him. For a brief moment, it was clear that he didn't know how to respond. His words failed him, and the tension between them deepened. Finally, Clark broke the silence, his voice taking on a harder edge as he gestured for Nathan to turn around. Turn around and place your hands on the hood. I need to check for weapons. Weapons? Nathan repeated incredulously. Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon? Clark's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, he seemed to crack. I'm not going to ask you again. Nathan hesitated, then turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of the car, allowing Clark to perform a search. The officer moved quickly, his hands rough and intrusive. But Nathan didn't react. He stood still, unwavering, giving Clark no sign of discomfort. You're clean, Clark muttered reluctantly as he stepped back. The words were almost an admission of defeat. Of course I am, Nathan replied coolly. He looked at Clark, his expression calm, but his eyes piercing. Now, officer, if you're done? I'm not done, Clark interjected, his voice rising. You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why? Nathan crossed his arms. His posture relaxed despite the tension between them. I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement, he said. Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years. Clark's eyes narrowed. You a lawyer or something? Or something, Nathan replied vaguely, his answer clearly annoying Clark further. The officer stepped closer, invading Nathan's personal space, his voice dropping to a low growl. You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this? Nathan met his gaze evenly, unwavering. I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here. The words landed like a challenge, and Clark took the bait. Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always. He stopped himself abruptly, the words hanging in the air. Nathan's expression didn't change, but something about his stance shifted. His calmness was now a blade, cutting through the officer's carefully constructed persona. People like me? Nathan asked softly, his voice charged with meaning. Clark bristled and took a step back, realizing his mistake. You know what I mean, he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. I think I do, Nathan replied quietly. And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago. Clark opened his mouth to argue but hesitated. For the first time, he was unsure of how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and Nathan was in control now. I think it's time you know who I am, Nathan said, his voice steady and unyielding. Clark's eyes narrowed. I don't care who you are, he shot back, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. Nathan reached into his pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. I'm reaching for my badge, he said calmly. No theatrics. I want you to see it. Clark's eyes followed Nathan's hand, and when the leather wallet emerged, he watched as Nathan flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. Nathan Hayes, Nathan said casually, as if introducing himself to a neighbor. Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Police Department. Clark froze, his expression shifting from disbelief to shock. His gaze darted from the badge to Nathan's face, searching for any sign that this was some kind of joke. But there was no humor, only quiet authority and a hint of disappointment. Internal Affairs? Clark whispered, his voice cracking slightly. Yes, Nathan replied, his tone sharp. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the officers in this department uphold the integrity and values the badge is meant to represent. Clark's face paled as his bravado unraveled. He took a small step back, as though the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too much to bear. Nathan closed the gap, stepping forward. You know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Clark? Nathan asked, his voice calm but piercing. Clark didn't answer, but his eyes said it all. He knew exactly what Nathan was about to say. It's not the profiling, Nathan continued. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. Clark opened his mouth, but no words came out. Nathan's gaze locked onto his. Unrelenting. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. Nathan said, because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect. The words hit like an indictment, and Clark's shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of them. Nathan paused, giving him a moment to absorb it. That's not just a problem for me, officer. It's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform. The silence that followed was thick with realization. Clark looked down at Nathan's badge again, as if hoping it would disappear if he looked away long enough. Nathan stepped back, his voice still carrying the weight of authority. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step back, return my documents, and think carefully about what you say next. Clark hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing on him. Finally, he reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Nathan's license and registration, his hands trembling as he handed them over. Nathan accepted them without a word, tucking them into his wallet as he stepped toward the driver's side door. Before getting into his car, he glanced over his shoulder, meeting Clark's gaze one final time. Remember this, Officer Clark, Nathan said. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone. As Nathan slid into his car and drove away, Clark stood in the fading light, his confidence shattered and his future uncertain. But for Nathan, this was just the beginning. The next morning, Nathan sat at his desk, the sunlight filtering through the blinds of his office in the Internal Affairs Division. The file in front of him was marked Officer Damon Clark. It wasn't the first file of its kind, and it wouldn't be the last. He knew the job ahead of him wasn't just about fixing one bad apple. It was about addressing the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. The following day, Nathan's career trajectory took an unexpected turn. His voice would shape the future of the Sacramento Police Department, and the ripple effect would be felt for years to come. This wasn't just another story. It was a turning point,